Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. So today I'm going to show you how you can safely and very easily overclock your own GPU. But before we do that, as always, please consider subscribing to the channel if you haven't already. Also turn on notifications so you never miss one of my new videos. Now, before I go and show you guys practically how you can do that, first of all, I want to address some misconception, or let's say some mistakes that usually people do, and that is that many people go ahead and ask the same question: what is the best overclock settings for my particular GPU or CPU, whatever the case may be? I see many times people ask this question where basically they want to know the specific core clock, specific memory clock, fan speed, power limit, and so on, so they can immediately apply them and they think that they would be good to go. But obviously we know that sometimes these settings might work even for different GPUs, but also we need to know that not all chips are built the same way, or let's say that they are built the same way, but not all chips perform the same way. So technically what I want to say with this is that you should avoid this method of overclocking, especially your GPU in this case, because as we said, not all chips are performing the same way. So this means that your particular GPU might work with the settings that someone might give you, but also this means that those settings can be unstable, or maybe they can push your GPU a little bit more than you should push it. So technically this means that you need always to find your hardware limit by yourself. You don't want to go ahead, grab some numbers that someone throws at you, and then apply them to your GPU, CPU, or whatever the case may be, and then from there keep on going, because you might do a mistake and you might risk damaging your hardware. So technically what I'm trying to say again is that you always should find your own overclock, or let's say your own safe overclock settings for your GPU in this case. So now to do that, the procedure is very easy, especially with the new hardware that we have nowadays. It's even easier because although the manufacturers themselves, they are trying to make the hardware as intelligent as possible when it comes to overclocking. That's why we see boost clocks and power limit and so on. That's why we have so many different things that we can change, because the manufacturers themselves they work on these specific things. Now you see here on the startup button that I have this activated, but when you do overclocking, especially when you do overclocking testing, I always suggest you keep this option disabled, because if you set some settings that might get your system unstable and then it shuts itself down, and then turns back on, then if you have this enabled, then those clocks that you set are going to be applied automatically when Windows starts up. Then the system will shut down itself again to save itself, so you might run into a loop if you have this activated. So make sure you have the startup button disactivated, although I have it here activated because I know my clocks, but keep this in mind that this needs to be deactivated, so, or let's say turned off. Another very important thing that you need to know, guys, when you do the overclocking of your GPU or any other hardware in your system, that many people do this mistake, is that I highly recommend that you do not have the other components overclocked, which means Practically in this case, if you want to overclock your GPU, make sure that your CPU is not overclocked. Make sure that your CPU is at default clock, make sure that the RAM is at default clock, and make sure that even the motherboard is at default clock, because believe it or not, there are many people out there that try to overclock their system by playing with the base clock of the motherboard, which technically means that by changing that you are technically overclocking all the components on your system. And this is done for the only purpose to avoid misinformation from the crashes. Because, for example, if you have your CPU and RAM and motherboard overclocked, and obviously you then begin overclocking your GPU, you might get a system crash while you are testing. But definitely you don't want this to happen, because it might be your overclock on your CPU that is causing the instability, or RAM or motherboard. It depends on what you have overclocked on your system. So this can give you a wrong information about your GPU overclock, because if you have a crash, you might think that it's your GPU overclock problem, but on the other hand, that might be the problem of the CPU that you have overclocked. So again, if you want to overclock your GPU, make sure all the other components are at default settings, or at least if you have them overclocked, make sure that overclock is very stable and it doesn't create crashes. But I highly recommend that at least until you find the limits of your GPU overclock, you set them to default, and then you can re-overclock them to where they were. So in this case, you know for sure that if you get into a crash, if you get into a system instability, you will know for sure that that crash, that instability, or that artifacts is going to be from the GPU and not from another hardware that you might have overclocked before going on with the GPU. Okay, then with that out of the way, and this means that you now have decided to do your own overclock, now that jump on how you can do that yourself. And first things first, you need not to be afraid, because nowadays obviously the manufacturers themselves, they offer us some automatic overclocks. That's why we see boost clocks, power limits, and so on. So technically the GPUs, CPUs and RAM nowadays, they can overclock themselves, but obviously we want to do our own overclock because we need to get the most out of our hardware, in this case our GPU. So don't be afraid about that, because besides the overclocking options that we can do and that the manufacturers offer us, obviously the manufacturers have added many safe features about their hardware. So technically, if for example we push the limit of our hardware, obviously they have some safe fails built in on the GPU. So technically, if the temperatures goes too high because we set the core clock too high, or the memory clock too high, or the power limit too high, then the GPU has some safe feature when technically it will lower the clock of the GPU, so it can keep it under control, and it might go until the point where it shuts itself down, so you can avoid to damage your hardware. So that's why I say you don't have to be afraid to overclock your GPU nowadays, because at the end, even if you mess something, there are still going to be safe fails that the developers have built into our GPUs. Now, the way we can overclock our GPU obviously is through an application. In this case, I'm going to use MSI Afterburner, and I highly recommend you to use the same application, because in my particular case, I'm going to show you guys how you can overclock an RTX card, which applies to all the RTX cards, but not on the amount of memory clock that we can add or core clock that we can add, but it applies to the way how you can overclock your GPU, and not only to the NVIDIA cards, but obviously this method applies to all the overclockings on any GPU that you may have. You just need to keep in mind that you need to go slowly on the overclock so you can be safe and not risk damaging anything. Although we already said that modern GPUs now, they have some safe features out there where they can protect themselves, let's call it this way. Okay, now let's jump into the meat of the video, where I show you practically how you can overclock your GPU. Now today I'm going to overclock my particular GPU, which is an RTX 2070 Super. It's the Gallardo edition from Manly, and although I might have specific core clocks and memory clocks and power limits and so on for my GPU, those clocks might apply to your GPU, but definitely you need to try this for yourself. So at the end you will find the limit of your GPU, because your GPU might perform a little bit worse than mine, but obviously it might perform a little bit better than mine. So I'm not too concerned about the maximum clock that we will find or the maximum memory clock that we will find, but I just want to show you guys the method how you can get to those results, let's say, to those maximum results. So technically this means that the method applies to all video cards out there, not only the RTX cards. So keep this in mind, because this method can be used with any graphics card. So again, we're not going to focus on only NVIDIA and RTX card, but this is the method that you can use with any video card. Alright then, so after you have gotten your overclocking application, if you have gotten MSI Afterburner, it should look something like this if you have the skin that I use, but obviously it might look a little bit different, but the same options apply to any skin that you set the MSI Afterburner. And what we need to look in MSI Afterburner to be able to overclock our GPU is going to be core voltage, power limit, temp limit, core clock, memory clock, and fan speed. So just make sure with any skin that you might use with the looks of Afterburner, make sure to have these things in your site. So then we can proceed with the method how you can overclock your GPU. Now, first thing to know when you overclock your GPU, and I think that this is the most important thing that you need to know, it's keeping in check your temperature, because especially when we overclock, we directly hit the temperature of our GPU, and obviously a high temperature is going to damage, or let's say is going to shorten the life of our hardware, in this case GPU. So if we keep the temperature under control, this means that our GPU is going to last as long as possible. And about this topic, this topic takes also many discussions, because it depends on what you think a safe temperature is for your GPU. But in my case, what I think a safe temperature would be under load for a GPU is if you can get it to run under 85C, or even better under 80C, but I still would prefer under 80C under full load of the GPU. As you see in here right now on the screen, I have Heaven benchmark running on the background, with full settings, with all the settings maxed out, and as you can see, core clock of my GPU is 1905 in automatic mode, memory clock is at 6800, obviously automatic mode, fan speed at 40%, all the settings that you see in here are on default, and as you see, the temperature is hanging between 73 to 76 C, which is technically what I consider to be safe. If you can manage to lower the temperature even further, that would be even better. But obviously if you go above 80°C, that I would consider to begin seeing at a problem. Not that it's a huge problem, because obviously the GPU is not going to run under load for extended periods of time, so that 80°C is going to be for a limited amount of time. But anyway, keeping it under 80°C, it's very recommendable. Let's call it this way. But also the temperature is affected by many other factors. Because it depends on where you live, it depends on the temperature of the room where your PC is, it depends on the airflow that your case have, if you have a case. Because obviously the case and the airflow in the case is going to have a direct impact in your GPU temperature, so you have to keep all those things in mind when you overclock. So technically just look at the temperature, and if you go above 80°C, then you need to take action, and if you are under 80°C, then you can decide to push it a little bit more, and so on. It depends on what you set your maximum target for the GPU temperature. And as you see in here, by default the power limit adds 100%, which means that the GPU is going to draw up to 100% power from my computer if it needs it. And obviously the temperature limit is going to be at 83°C, which technically means if the GPU is going to go to or let's say that the temperature limit first of all says to the GPU that you can go up to 83°C, so you can pull power or you can raise your clock, and you are going to be safe until you go to 83°C. And after 83°C, technically you say to your GPU with the temp limit that you can go to up to 83°C, but if you pass 83°C, this means that you have to lower down your power limit, or you have to lower down your GPU and memory clock, but usually it's a GPU clock, so you can keep the temperature at 83°C. So this is done automatically by the GPU itself. So that's why what the power limit and the temp limit do. So again, the power limit says to the GPU that you can draw up to 100% power from the system if you need to, and the temp limit says that you can go up to 83°C, so you can keep the boost clock up to 83°C, but if you pass 83°C, then you have to lower down the clock so you can keep under 83°C. So this is the first step you need to set for your GPU. If you are safe with 83°C, you can leave it here. If you want your GPU not to go to 83, you can lower it a little bit down. But as you see, they move together, power limit and temp limit, because they are linked. So if you want to change this, then you can unlink them. So you can say to the GPU, okay, you can draw up to 100% power from the system, but don't go over 80°C. You can go up to 80°C, but you should not go more than that. So if you pass 80°C, then lower the clocks down and you should go under 80°C. So this is done automatically. You don't have to do anything about this. Usually, we need to keep in mind that when you want to overclock, obviously you need to raise a little bit the power limit and obviously the temperature limit, because it's inevitable that you are going to put more stress to your GPU, so technically the temperatures are going to be a little bit higher. So usually when I overclock my GPU, I keep the power limit obviously to 100% and I take the temperature limit to 85°C, and this is totally fine, because this does not mean that we have to bring our CPU to 85°C, because we can use the fan speed, and by the fan speed we can always keep in check the temperature. But also with the fan speed we have to keep in mind that we are going to increase a little bit the noise emitted by the fan. So we have to, let's say, find a balance between temperature that we want to see on our GPU and noise that our GPU produces. So you have to find your own, let's say, balance here between temperature and fan noise. Okay, after I have set the power limit and the temp limit as I like, these are my preferences, but you might prefer some other values in here. But you have to keep in mind that, for example, if you say to the GPU that you can draw up to 90% power, this means that the GPU is never going to draw up to 100% power from the system, which means if, for example, the GPU needs 100% power to keep the temperature limit or the core clock that we have set, or let's say to keep the FPS target, since we have limited the power, this means that in some cases it might happen that it will perform a little bit worse, let's say FPS wise. That's why I say that if you want to overclock your GPU, definitely you need to keep the power limit at least at 100%. So basically you say to the GPU, use your full potential to be able to draw as much power as you need, and obviously give me the more FPS and this the most stable clocks that you can give me, or that I set you to give me. So that's why I like to set the power limit to 100% and temp limit to 85°C, because as I said, already said, we can keep the temperatures in check by playing with the fan speed. After that, obviously comes the good thing, and the good thing, obviously, or let's say the only change that is going to give us more performance by overclocking is always going to be the core clock or the GPU clock itself. And in NVIDIA cards, or let's say if you have an NVIDIA card, the core clock is going to be in megahertz, obviously, but is going to be set in megahertz over the base clock, which means if you set, for example, here plus 100 and hit enter, basically you say to the GPU of NVIDIA, overclock yourself up to 100 megahertz over your base clock. And I say this because this is very important, because if you have an AMD GPU, the core clock is totally different, which basically means that if you have an AMD GPU, here you don't set let's say the amount of megahertz over the base clock of the GPU, but in AMD you set the let's say the final clock of the GPU. For example, if I had an AMD GPU in here and the base clock is 1905, here to overclock it you must set it at plus let's say, for example, 2000. So technically you add the full speed of the core clock, not the speed that the GPU must go over the base clock. That's the difference between AMD and NVIDIA. So please keep this in mind, because this is very important. So again, if you have an NVIDIA graphics card, when you set the core clock, you basically say to the GPU, overclock this amount of megahertz over your base clock. So technically, if you set the clock like AMD, for example, plus 2000, this means that you are going to set your GPU clock to plus 2000 over the base clock, which is very, very bad, and you don't want this to happen. So keep this in mind. Again, with NVIDIA, you set the amount of megahertz over the base clock, where with AMD you set the megahertz of the total amount of the GPU or core clock in this case. So please guys, keep this in mind, so you don't mess with this, because it might, well, we cannot say that it will immediately damage your GPU, but let's say that it will be bad setting a wrong clock. So please keep this in mind again. Okay, so in my case, for the core clock, if you have an NVIDIA GPU, especially an RTX card, I'm pretty sure that all the cards out there, that NVIDIA RTX card that are out there, even GTX ones, can easily get to plus 100 megahertz over the base clock. So what I usually do when I overclock my GPU, I immediately go, in this case NVIDIA GPU, I immediately go plus 100, which technically means I say to the GPU, you can go 100 megahertz over your base clock, and hit OK, and now it is applied. And as you see, the clock went from 1905 to 1995. It's not precise, the clock, because it has usually the NVIDIA clocks go with steps of 15, if I'm correct, 15 megahertz at a time. So it's not going to be precisely 100 megahertz, but still around 100 megahertz, so we should say. And then obviously comes the memory clock, which basically is it's the same thing as the core clock. You say to the memory, go this amount of megahertz over the base clock. In my case, my base clock is 6800 megahertz, so I can say, for example, go plus 500 megahertz over the base clock. Now I know that my RTX can handle the 500 megahertz over the base clock, but I suggest you go with steps like 200 megahertz over the base clock. So for example, let's say go plus 200 megahertz, hit enter, hit OK, and you will see that the clock will apply 7000 megahertz now overclock in the memory. Okay then, so basically we are almost done now. We have set the power limit, we have set the temperature limit, we have set the core clock overclock, let's say, we have set the memory overclock, and now we can play with the fan speed. Since I know that my GPU can handle it automatically fine with these clocks, I will leave it in automatic. But if, for example, you are not comfortable with 77C or 80C or even 70C, then definitely you can turn off auto mode and set your own fan speed. Let's say, for example, 50%. And hit enter and then OK to confirm, and the fan speed is going to be at 50% all the time, or maybe you can go even at 100%. It's totally up to you, and obviously you have to find let's say a middle ground between temperatures and obviously the noise that the fans are going to make by setting up a higher, let's say higher than 50%. And as you see, the temperatures went down at 50%, obviously because it is a little bit faster that it was handling automatically. But again, I want to keep it at auto because I want my GPU to stay quiet. I don't care if it's at 75, 77, up to 80, I'm good with my GPU, because again, even though 80 is a little bit high, over 75 it's a little bit high, but yet again, I'm not going to keep my GPU fully loaded for extended periods of time, so that's totally fine for me. But anyway, you might have a different opinion, so you have to choose your own fan speed based on the temperature target that you want to keep for your GPU. Okay then, so basically now we are 99% done with the overclock that you can do with your GPU. Now what remains is go ahead and see if your GPU is going to be stable with the settings that you have changed. Here you can see that I was running the whole time on the background the Valley, not the Valley, the Heaven benchmark, but you can run Valley benchmark, you can run superposition benchmark. They are the same thing, basically are a little bit old, but they run into a loop, and obviously they stress your GPU, they stress your CPU, so you can keep you can keep all the settings under control while you are changing them, because with this one you can do the changes live, and you can also see the temperatures. You can see if you have artifacts in the image, so you know you are getting over let's say over the limit that your GPU can handle. And I totally recommend that you leave the application that you select, you leave it running for at least 1 to 2 hours just to be safe, and then come back and check the temperatures. Check the temperatures. You can check the temperatures obviously here on the graph. Check the memory clock, if it has gone down, or if it has gone up. You definitely should check the memory clock, the power limit, and so on, so you know that your overclock was safe. And obviously if the system didn't crash, you might then take a look at closely if you see some artifacts in the image. That also another indicator that your clocks are a little bit higher than it should be, and so on. Or if you see sudden spikes in temperature, or core clock, memory clock, power usage, and so on. Obviously these spikes in here in the power limit are because of the changes in the scenes. That's why you see the spikes sometimes, but these are small spikes. So if you see big movements, then something is wrong with your overclock. Okay, then now we are practically done. So after testing, after seeing that all is fine, the longer you do the test, and as many tests as you do, the better it will be to know that your system is going to be stable, so you know that your overclock is going to be fine. After you find that your current overclock is okay, then you can begin on going on with the next steps, which definitely are going to be smaller than the first step. And saying that, I mean that if, for example, we went into the core clock in the NVIDIA cards, obviously because with the AMD you need to enter the full clock in here. If we went here plus 100 megahertz, now I definitely don't recommend and go, for example, plus 200 megahertz, because it is too much. Although some specific video cards may handle this core clock, but again, I considered plus 200 megahertz a little bit too much for the RTX card. So from plus 100 megahertz, I would suggest you go with the 10 megahertz increase, or at least the maximum 20 megahertz increase. For example, let's say from now on we go with plus 110 megahertz over the base clock, hit enter, hit OK, and we have applied the clock as you see in here. And now from now on, I would suggest the same thing that I told you about setting the other components to default clock. So from now on, just go ahead and increase only the core clock. Do not play with the memory clock, because we don't want to interfere with the stability thing. Because, for example, we might say we might set 150 on the core clock, we might set 500 on the memory clock, and we might get into a crash or instability or artifacts. But then we cannot know if it was the problem of the memory clock or if it was the problem of the core clock. That's why I say that you, at least from now on, you should go only with a memory clock until you find that point where you get crashes, or where you get too high temperatures that you are not comfortable with, or when you get artifacts and so on. So you will know the maximum. You will know the maximum that your core clock can handle on your GPU. Let's say, for example, you found your maximum. Let's say your GPU crashed or has become unstable at 200 megahertz. Then from that point, I would suggest you go down at least 20 megahertz. So in my case, my maximum overclock that I can get in my GPU is plus 150 some games work with 150, but some other applications and games do not work with 150. So I know that my system is not stable at plus 150. So from this moment I set my memory clock to, or core clock, to plus, so let's click it, to plus 130, 20 megahertz below the clock when I begin getting instability or artifacts or crashes of the system. And till now I have found that using this method I have never had any problems with any game, any application. So we can call it that it's safe to using it this way. And obviously the same thing goes for the memory clock. I know that my GPU can handle plus 1000 megahertz on the memory. I can hit OK. And obviously you have to keep in mind that I am also recording with this computer, so it might be maybe a little bit choppy on the viewing side, but unfortunately I don't have any other methods to record the video. So yeah, and as I was saying, the same thing about the memory clock. If I set the memory clock to plus 1100 megahertz, then it will become unstable with some applications and I will not be able to play. But obviously in some applications works, in some others doesn't work. So for the memory, I would suggest that when you find that point where you get crashes or instabilities, you go down at least 100 megahertz from that point. And as I told you, in my case, 1100 megahertz is the point where I begin getting some instabilities, so I go down 100 megahertz, so I leave it at plus 1000 megahertz, and I never had any problems with this kind of overclocks with my GPU. As you can see, boost clock goes to 210, sometimes goes a little bit more to 250. It depends on the temperature. For example, if I set the fan speed, for example, to 60%, then the temperature is going to go a little bit down, and obviously since the temperature is going down, then the boost clock is going to go a little bit higher. So it depends, all depends on the temperature. So even the default way how the GPU boost clock works is all dependent on the power limit and obviously the temperature. So definitely this is the one thing you have to keep in mind when you want to overclock your GPU. Now this was the manual thing how you can overclock your GPU, and as you saw, 72C. Now the core clock boosted to 2025 from 210 that it was before, so you saw it happen live, well live in the video but not live, well, you know what I mean. Anyway, so this is the way how you can overclock your GPU. I think it's pretty easy to do it yourself, so you don't have to ask someone else what is your best overclock setting for your GPU, and it's best to do it this way because this way you don't risk getting into trouble, because you will go step by step in small steps of increase in core clock, memory clock, fan speed and so on. So you will find that instability point yourself, so you can back down a little bit from there and you should be good to go, and there you will find your perfect and maximum overclock that you can get on your GPU. Now, except from the manual way that I showed you, there is also an automatic way which you can use with MSI Afterburner, and is this button in here. As you see, I think this is only for Nvidia cards or maybe even with some AMD cards. I don't know about that, let me know. But if you have this option, overclock, in here with the loop, you click this one in here. Basically what it does some tests by itself. The tests are done from MSI Afterburner. Basically it does a loop test of the GPU by setting different different core clock speed and memory speed, and obviously checking the temperature and the fan curve and so on. And based on the temperature and the overclock settings that this application does, it determines a curve on how the GPU will overclock. And after the test is finished, I think it takes around 10 minutes to 15 minutes, maybe a little bit less. Then you will see in here in the core clock sessions, where you see plus 130, you will see something written curve, which means that the GPU itself, or let's say MSI Afterburner, is going to apply the clocks of the curve that it found it to be stable and giving you the best performance out of your GPU. This is automatic, but I find this curve to be a little bit low in my case. I found it to go a maximum of 1950 megahertz. It cannot go higher than that. Maybe it can go to 1965, but obviously since I can go manually to over 2000 megahertz, obviously I use the manual mode about overclocking my GPU. Okay then, so I think I covered all the steps that you need to know how to overclock your GPU. Again, go in small steps. Do set your target temperature, what you like your video card temperature to be. As I said, if I keep my my video card under 80C, I'm cool, because I don't keep my GPU for extended periods of times above 75C, so I'm cool with that. But even at 75C is totally a safe temperature for the GPU, don't you worry about that. But obviously if you can keep it lower than that, obviously it's better for the GPU and the lifespan of the GPU. So technically this is personal on which temperature you are comfortable with, but any temperature under 85C, or even better under 80C, it's totally safe, even with extended periods of time. But if you go over 80C, especially over 85C, that's a temperature where you need to worry a little bit, especially if you want to do extended periods of time of using the GPU with those speeds. But even if you go to 80 to 85C, if you do, like, say for example 2 hours, 3 hours, or maybe maximum of 4 hours of loading times and staying at that temperature, I think it's fine for the modern GPUs. But anyway, you still have the options to play with the fan speed, to play with the power limit, and so on. So you can set your own targets for GPUs, core clock, memory clock, and so on. Many other stuff. And there is one more step that we can do, but I don't recommend this step because it stresses your GPU very high. And obviously you may have noticed that we never mentioned it during the video, but it's the core voltage percentage. What this does, basically, as you can see, plus 100%, except the power limit, what this does, it says to the GPUs that over your power limit you can draw up to, let's say for example, 20% more, which means if for example your GPU at 100% power limit draws 100 watts and you set the core voltage plus 20%, this means that you say to your GPU, increase your power limit to plus 20% more. So technically your GPU will now be able to draw up to 120 watts. But it can do that, but you have to keep in mind that you have to have very good cooling, you have to have a very good GPU, you need to have a very good PSU to be able to provide that consistent power to the GPU, because what this core voltage does in here, technically is over the normal wattage or power that your GPU is going to use. So you have to be very careful with these settings. Definitely you might play a little bit. For example, if I set this to 10%, I can go more than plus 130 on the core clock, and obviously a little bit more in the memory clock, but I don't feel safe and comfortable with that, because by setting the core voltage more than it should have, definitely you will get more stress into the GPU, and definitely you will get a higher temperature. So you have to keep this in mind. Although it's totally doable, you need to keep in mind that you will stress more your GPU, you will stress more your power cables, you will stress more your PSU and so on, and obviously you will get higher temperatures. But definitely you can, because not always, but in many cases you will get higher overclocks that you would by playing only with the power limit in here. So yeah, it was a very long video, sorry about that guys, but I just wanted to share with you guys all the small steps and all the information that I think it's useful for you to know, because at the end of the day you can do it by yourself, you can do it safely, you can do it easily, and I think it's fun to play with your own overclocks, to play with your own hardware, and you don't have to go and grab a number that someone else told you, because that number might be a total BS and maybe you might run into problems with those numbers. So in this way you can set your own maximum overclock settings for your GPU by just playing with these little knobs and numbers that you see in MSI Afterburner, and obviously testing games or benchmarks, other stuff. So yeah, at the end for someone it can be fun, like it is for me. Okay, that was it for today guys. Thank you very much for watching, thank you very much for your support. As always, for the new people, don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already, also turn notifications so you never miss one of my new videos, and also stay tuned because I am in the process of doing a video comparison for this particular video card that I have, the RTX 2070 Super Gallardo edition. I am testing the default clocks with the overclock that I can get with this GPU. I will try to get higher clock speeds and higher memory speeds, obviously by playing with the fan speed, and at the end, after the benchmarks, we will see if the overclock is even worth it for the gains that we get in FPS. So stay tuned for that video, hopefully it will come as soon as possible, but yeah, it's take a little bit of time to do that, but anyway, I will try my best. Alright then, thanks again for watching guys, and yeah, as always, catch you on the next one. Bye bye.